Today we have quite a few panelists with us, a very distinguished panel, and I'll start from the left here. Our moderator will be Jonathan Solomon, who's the director and chair of the Architecture, Interior Architecture, and Design Objects Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. We have Dan Handel, who is the lead curator of architecture and design at the Israel Museum. We have Zoe Ryan, the John H. Bryan Chair and Curator of Architecture and Design at the Art Institute of Chicago. Aric Chen, the lead curator of architecture and design at M+ from Hong Kong. We're thrilled to have you all the way from over there. And James Zemaitis, who's the curator and director of museum relations at R & Company, exhibiting at the fair this year. Please join us in giving a very warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. I think we have to turn these on. I had to, okay. Good afternoon and welcome. So curating in place. All right, last spring, around the time that Stephanie and I were meeting to talk about this panel and set it up, I was out for dinner at a restaurant that had just opened near the school where I work. And after we had been looking over the menu for a little while, a man came over to take our order, myself and my colleagues, and I took the opportunity to compliment the man on the beer list at this restaurant, which was really actually terrific. And his face just lit up. He got this big, genuine smile on his face, and he said, "Thank you." He said, "I curated the beer list." Okay. The joke is, of course, that everybody's a curator today. It's a term that's used. It's used very freely. It's used very broadly. So much so that it becomes almost it's become almost a joke, right? That everyone now on their social media feeds, right, is a curator, and now. I agree. That's why I told the story, which was supposed to be funny, but people didn't really laugh. I gave you an opportunity. I paused. Yeah, I paused. You thought it was a serious story. I understand. Just because the term is overused, however, doesn't mean that curating isn't an act that's actually increasingly more frequent and increasingly more relevant. And just to continue the analogy. I read that last year the number of breweries in the United States finally surpassed its 1873 high. There's something like nearly 2,000 independent individual breweries in the United States. And so perhaps once you get out to that quantity and that range of different qualities, it might actually take a curatorial practice to select among them and condense them down to a list to be presented for consideration at a meal. And of course, it's not just the number of breweries, but it's the distribution networks that allow you to kind of, right, you no longer have to live in the town next door. You can order it on Amazon or whatever, or go to your Whole Foods and find it on a shelf. So that's an analogy, of course, for a broader environment in which information is, we were just talking, information is everywhere and it's immediately accessible to everybody, that the job of the curator, which might once have been to select things and give them visibility, is now actually the opposite. It is to remove information from the system and to create out of that kind of fog of possible bits of information, legible stories that we can understand, that we can take in, that can make that information relevant to us. And today we're really lucky to have four amazing curators from around the world in the fields of art, architecture, and design, who are all, each in their own way, engaging with very specific institutions in very specific places to do just that. So, without wasting any more time from the periphery here, we will begin with a presentation from Dan.
All right, can you hear me? Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, it work? Okay, that's me. That's how my name is spelled. All right, so when I got the brief for this conversation today, I was thinking of my first project. I'm working at the Israel Museum these days, but I'm fairly new. I've only been working there for 4 months, a little bit more than that, and this is my first project. But this first project is very relevant in a way to this theme, because it's a collection based, as most first projects are in museum context. This is a collection-based exhibition. So I start with this image by Humboldt from the 19th century, analyzing the Andes Mountains in Ecuador. And this has been a leading metaphor, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Because the first question, really, when looking at the collection, is what's in it. So this begins a series of investigations, and place. There are different notions of place that were relevant in the process of developing this project. First one was the collection as a place, the collection as a site to be inquired. The second one was the place in a more conventional sense of context and how things got into the collection over time. And the third one was the exhibition space. So the space we have in order to exhibit this collection exhibition, in this case, determines a lot what's going to be in the show, which is to be open in a couple of months. So this is a very quick project as well. Yeah, I should point it somewhere. Okay, so a few things about the collection as a site, as a place that you could inquire. When I was working as an independent curator, I would usually approach institutions with collections. I did a couple of these projects. I would usually approach them with a hypothesis or a preconception, if you may. Okay, I would know in a way what I'm looking for, even though I wouldn't know what the exact objects are. So this would be like a NASA mission, you know, when you're looking for signs of life and you're searching for the evidence to support it. But after living a while in the same space, in the same place, if you may, with this collection in the museum, going there every day where the collection is physically stored, I began to think that perhaps what we should do here is not to have a preconception, but actually present the collection in its entirety. So show the whole thing. So the question became, could we really show a whole collection? Not do an abstraction, not do a highlights exhibition, 20 best chairs or I don't know what, but really try to first understand and then show everything. So in order to do that, I had to go through everything, which was a great micro-research project. And the way we did that is basically analyzing everything that's in there. That's more than 10,000 objects in the collection, so it's fairly big, or it's not small anyway. We categorized them according to very broad categories that you can see here, use categories, but these are very loose categories that we could play with. And I'm just going to show you one, just to sort of demonstrate the protocols of what we did for each. So that's my table. We basically, collected all of the photos of all of the objects and arranged them on a table. This was a lot of fun. And then the idea was, how do you analyze that? How do you analyze each category, not only as a accumulation of stuff, okay, but how do you make sense out of it? And this is where the place in sort of second sense came into play, understanding what's generic in the collection, because this is a huge eclectic collection. So what's generic in the collection and what's specific in the collection, and creating a sort of spectrum that goes from the more generic one, which would be things like, the iPod Classic that we have as an object in our collection, things that are more associated with certain designers, in this case, the Bellini record player from the 60s, which you would probably find in most major design collections. And as we go up, limited editions objects such as this Mars of Wonders, Can of Gold, and more, in a way, place-related stuff. This anonymous Israeli designers designed this series of objects, or furniture objects, in the 50s, and we have them, to some amazing objects that you could only find in our own collection. This is Franziska Baruch. She's a German, later Israeli graphic designer, and she designed these molds for biscuits. So this is kind of an amazing object. It also sort of combines typography, symbolism, it shows a little bit of Jerusalem as well. So very unique object and only one that exists. So in a way, the composition of all of these scales sort of represents the accumulation of objects over time and the specificity of our collection. So then the third notion of place, how do you present that, right? You have thousands of objects that you want to show. You have a very small space. So I don't have the answer yet because the project is not ready. But what we began to do is basically analyzing the size of objects in a very pseudo-scientific way in order to understand how much can we push into this gallery. So this represents the same list as before, but big, small, super small, etc. So as I said, very analytic, not really, but trying to look very analytic. And we have the different scales of objects according to generic volumes, representing the different groups I showed you before. And this is the sort of big black box of the very small exhibition space that we have, in which we could potentially put these numbers of objects in every scale. And this is just to show that if you think of things massively, I mean, if you don't come with a preconception, you do not try to make any value judgments, you just want to show the collection as it is. I think the way to dictate what's going to go in and what's going to be left out should come from a different consideration. It should come from the space itself, from the design of the exhibition, which is where we are at the moment. So if we're going back to the Humboldt Mountain, I think, again, it's a very appropriate analogy, because in a way what this exhibition is trying to do is something like this. It's trying to show the thing in its entirety, the thing as a sort of big picture, so you could understand the big picture of the collection. But then the idea is that people could also communicate and understand the stories, the small narratives, the histories, the coincidences that through which this specific collection was accumulated. So in a way, it's a sort of our own design mount that's going to be the exhibition in a couple of months. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Stephanie, wherever she is, and thanks, EXPO, for inviting us to participate today. Curating in place was the challenge that Jonathan set us. And of course, like Dan, I started to think, perhaps for us, because we're at the Art Institute of Chicago, Chicago should be what I was going to talk about. But given that we only have 10 minutes or less, I thought maybe I should be a little bit more specific and talk a little bit more about an aspect of what it means to work at the Art Institute of Chicago and what that place, the place of the museum, is. And what's important in terms of the work that we're doing right now. Obviously, the Art Institute is an encyclopedic collection. I would say probably most people coming to the museum are coming to see our Impressionist collection, or maybe our Contemporary Art collection, and more, I hope, they're coming to see architecture and design. And hopefully, by the end of next year, when we have permanent galleries for 20th and 21st century architecture and design, maybe I'll be saying most people are coming to see, architecture and design, or that's my hope. The Art Institute of Chicago, which I hope many of you have visited, and if you're out of towners, I hope you visited as a tourist or as a appreciator. We're fiercely protected, and we're also fiercely protective of our art. This is an image of when Michelle Obama came to the museum a few years ago. We have thick walls, which we do our best to break down. I think one of the things that I'm most interested in is our thick walls, how we engage a very broad audience, how we bring them into the museum, and how you create a much more social space within the museum. And how you try and break down some of the conventions that have been established since 1879 when the museum was founded, and really the conventional way of looking at art in our museum has not really evolved that much over that time, which is quite staggering when you actually think about it. It's a very interesting moment to be talking about museums. They're really grappling with how to remain relevant. I would say that's probably something that we talk about, almost every time we get to sort of meet up with people in the museum. How do we deal with people really wanting more digital experiences or understanding the museum through sort of the digital? Although I like to think of the museum as sort of the last bastion of an analog encounter, I have to admit that era is surely being compromised, with most people consuming art the way that they consume anything else on their phone, taking an image and then sharing that instantly with their friends. I do the same, I have to say. But maybe a larger problem is how do we maintain what is perhaps now a cliche, and that's the idea that museums are about slow space, they're about slowing the visitor down, getting them to really look, getting them to really see, developing a way of seeing, as John Berger so acutely noted. And that's what I think our job is. So yes, I think I do actually disagree with Jonathan, that I do think curators are still selectors. We still are about identifying things. I don't think that's changed. I think the world has always been a complex place, and identifying things and justifying why you are selecting things is still important. But I do think more and more curators are being charged to do lots of other things. One thing I also really firmly believe is that exhibitions are fundamental to an understanding of art, architecture and design. You can't really understand the history of architecture and design, for example, without looking at exhibitions. So that space really needs to be thought about, and that's kind of the place I want to talk about today. I'm not interested in exhibitions that are about teaching you something. As the astute architectural critic Jeff Kipnis has noted, once something teaches you something, it thinks for you. That doesn't mean that I'm not interested in places for learning, but I do think exhibitions are important in articulating ideas and bringing together points of urgency, suggesting future directions, but they're really the space in which narratives unfold. I'm currently working on a book with my colleagues at the museum about the history of architecture and design exhibitions, because there's so little, surprisingly, written about this, a very brief history of architecture and design exhibitions. And one of the things that I'm interested in is this idea of the social space of the exhibition. Now, I wouldn't say that I'm a rule breaker, but I definitely enjoy bending the rules, and this is surprisingly easy to do when you work at a place like the Art Institute. Here are it has lots of rules and stipulations, and quite rightly so. We are, one of the world's greatest museums. But anything that you want to do, so don't bring a selfie stick, they are strictly forbidden. This also goes for balloons, as you will see, flowers. So when considering the Art Institute as a social space, anything that's really about being social, food and drink, hanging out, gathering in groups, is all, either banned or kind of very restricted within the museum context. Wooden benches are our predominant occasional seating, so not the best for kind of hanging out. So we have tried to counter some of this in the work that we do. And although I'm interested in the social space of exhibitions, the kind of coming together of peoples, I am still interested in the conventional way that we look at art. And obviously this is Ferris Bueller's Day Off, film from 1986. And here we see Ferris Bueller, his girlfriend Sloane, and his best friend Cameron at the Art Institute, having a very typical one-on-one, experience with a work of art. And I still want this. I mean, I pretty much go to museums mainly alone, or perhaps with my family, but I don't typically go in a group. But I'm in a minority. I mean, lots more people, as our sort of museum analysis will tell us, are coming to the museum for a social experience. They want to come with their friends, and they come together because it's confidence building too. So sometimes we have that, but hopefully sometimes we can have this. Exhibitions that really do things that you're typically not supposed to do. So sitting on the furniture. Who would have thought that would be so wildly exciting in the museum context? But when you're constantly told, please don't touch, and don't sit on the furniture, obviously when you have a contemporary designer like Konstantin Gricic, where we were able to bring in work that everybody could sit on, obviously it lends itself to a very different kind of experience. The same for a fashion exhibition that I organised in 2012, where we had this sort of Aladdin's cave where you could go through. And it was very specific to these two designers. Constantine's work often looks very awkward. You're not even sure how you do sit on the furniture. Bless's work at the same time is very curious and intriguing, and it kind of begs you to want to try it out and touch it. And obviously you can't always do this in a museum, but sometimes you can. This is a project that I worked on with Karen Keiss, who's my colleague and in the audience, and we curated this exhibition together. And sometimes we've often worked by bringing the programming, like this programming, into the gallery. And it's different when you're sitting in an expo. I mean, if you've ever come to a museum and been to a program, you're typically in an auditorium, kind of divorced from the art. So actually being able to bring the programming into the gallery, very simple, but has worked very well. And then at times trying to get that one-to-one scale experience. So this was an exhibition we did recently on David Adjaye, the architect from Britain, where we had a pavilion which people could walk through. The most interesting thing I think about exhibitions is that then, for me, they're not a means to an end, although they have been for some people. They shouldn't be a means to an end. They should really be the beginnings of a conversation. We're opening up, hopefully, an interest and excitement about the fields of practice we're interested in, and shedding kind of sort of light on urgency. As Herbert Bayer once wrote, an exhibition should not retain its distance from the spectator. It should be brought close to him, end quote, and I would say to her. So ultimately, I see our job as rising to that challenge. I think with architecture and design, how can we do a better job of creating really engaging spaces or places for understanding architecture and design? And I think that we're probably all brothers and sisters in arms in this room, so I hope to hear some of your comments later.
Again, thank you for having me here. And I, like Dan, have only been in my new gig at R & Company for a few months. So I think in order to talk about what I do today, I need to kind of present a small background of what I've done before and how that's shaped my philosophy of what I'm trying to do today. I am certainly the most market-based individual among my colleagues here on the stage. For years, I have been in the auction business for 15, 16 years. I directed sales of 20th and 21st century decorative arts and design at the auction houses in New York. My longest tenure was at Sotheby's until 2013. And I was definitely, to go back to the early joke that Jonathan made, one of the people responsible for appropriating the term curating. We found when we were putting together auctions of furniture and objects, and we were trying to win these collections from people in order to sell those pieces, the word curating was a brilliant word to take from the other world. I'm curating this auction of George Nakashima's furniture. I'm curating this collection of Tiffany lamps here. And so, like cocktails and beer, we freely used that word as a way to describe that we weren't just selling stuff. We weren't just having auctions that whatever we could get our hands on. No, we were curating them. And we were carefully selecting everything that we're going to put together in that catalog for you. But as the years went on and I was doing more and more and more of these auctions, and our stage was in New York in these various very fast exhibitions that we would put up, where basically we would gather property to sell and then publish a catalog with 3 weeks to go, and then put this furniture out on view where you could look at it for all of 4 days to make your decision on. I started to long for something a little bit more permanent, and thus in 2013 I accepted a wonderful gig as a visiting curator in Indianapolis, where I was there curator of design and decorative arts for 2 years, and I had the opportunity to do sort of what Dan is doing now. I assess the collection and do a master plan of the collection and deal with what had been already gathered there, which was the country's largest on-view exhibition of contemporary design from 1980 to the present. And that is whence I started thinking about the concept of the permanent collection that each major American museum has in design, decorative arts, and craft, and what does that mean from institution to institution. And as Zoe was saying, I came from a world where everything I did involved the handling of the objects. The furniture that I appraised, the furniture that I sold, it was all about getting your collector's hands on that work, to assess it, to hold it. And the museum standards were non-existent when it comes to trying to actually sell something. And thus the exhibitions that we put on of the material that we're going to sell was, everyone was invited to step on that podium and look at it, sit in it, touch it. And suddenly I went to Indianapolis and I couldn't touch anything. And I couldn't touch anything, without a strict set of registrarial guidelines. And this included work that had been made yesterday and work that is available via Alessi right now that you can buy. And so that strange kind of suddenly disconnect I had where, something that you could own out there, we had cataloged as being museum quality, and I had to go through all of these rigorous guidelines before I myself could actually touch it. And of course, if you visited the gallery, in most cases, you could not touch it either, unless you had a sort of intervention sort of style exhibition, which does continue to grow right now. So let me just. I'm going to go to this photograph here. So when I left Indianapolis, before I joined R & Company, I guest curated an exhibition at another commercial gallery in New York, Friedman Benda, where I had the opportunity to basically do whatever I wanted in this exhibition, involving both historical work as well as contemporary work that was represented by that gallery. And the exhibition was called The Garden and the Machine, and it was on organic design from the early plywood era of the late 1920s and early 30s to the present. But it wasn't so much the theme of the exhibition that was important and what I was trying to achieve. It was making a statement about the current state of museum collections in New York. New York, obviously, there are two fantastic encyclopedic collections of 20th century design. There's the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's a Museum of Modern Art. There's also two additional collections in the Cooper Hewitt and the Museum of Art and Design, formerly the American Craft Museum. Not to mention on each side of Manhattan, you have the Brooklyn Museum and the Newark Museum for additional encyclopedic collections of decorative art. And yet, at this moment, at most moments, frankly, none of it is on view, ever. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has a teeniest of fraction of their work of 20th century decorative arts and design on view. MoMA just basically deinstalled what small amount of their collection they had on view to do yet another renovation. And it seems like the museums are constantly, when it comes to 20th century objects, treating that entire world like second, third, fourth class citizens in favor of more ephemeral exhibitions. And in fact, over the past year, the only, with the exception of smaller focused exhibitions at the Museum of Art and Design or up at the Bard Graduate Center, where there is now an exhibition on Alvar Aalto's furniture, there's no place to go see it except one smallish section of the Cooper Hewitt. And so it made me realize that the market was the only place in New York where people could actually experience furniture, where they could actually, and yet it's also this wonderful place where they can still touch it before it becomes absorbed into a museum collection. And so the show that we did at Friedman Bender earlier this spring was pretty much a statement on creating this sort of fantastic, fictitious world of a collection gallery at a museum that also broke down the barriers that these New York museums have. For example, at the Museum of Modern Art, craft is not allowed. Certain designers, certain architects that were deemed over the course of the MoMA's history to be not in perfect unison, in perfect lockstep with MoMA's vision, are not in the collection. And that can be an extraordinary range of designers, from a Pierre Shiro to a George Nakashima, for example. The Metropolitan has always had a much more encyclopedic collection that has focused on things such as incredibly strong in French Art Deco, but is also one of those museums that has multiple departments, and each department is a fiefdom, and thus the American Wings design is never mixed with the European Decorative Arts collection, and there has been virtually nothing on view post-1940 except these like teeny little moments. And so what we were trying to do was kind of create this world where a Harry Bertoia prototype chair done in his Cranbrook period there in the window could coexist peacefully with Wendell Castle and George Nakashima and Ron Arad. And in many ways, the overall organic theme was just something to kind of allow us to kind of make a statement about that. And the irony of the show was that most of the pieces that we did sell in the show, it was half commercial, half loan, were actually acquired by museums. And that's also something that had been troubling me for years at Sotheby's, and that was the ephemeral nature of the auction market doesn't allow for museum curators to make decisions quick enough. You know, it happens so fast. In many cases, the museums cannot literally get their act together to buy that work before it is sold over a 3-week period of time. So when you have a 3-month-long exhibition or a 2-month-long exhibition, you have a better shot of filling that need in a museum's permanent collection. So it was kind of a fantastic full circle in that the works that we did sell went to museums, including the Met, that actually acquired that Bertoia chair in the window right there. I think so, that's it. Yeah. Other pieces.
Anything else you want to say? Yeah. So I don't want to speed through these too quickly. All right. So that's me. I have a. I'll start with this. I'm coming from a fairly different situation than a lot of the other speakers here, because instead of trying to sort of untether myself from all this heavy baggage and the gravitas that these very established landmark institutions have, where I'm actually involved with a museum that is starting from scratch. It's a new museum being built completely from the ground up, including its collection and its building, which you sort of see, what you see a rendering of here. It's a museum for visual culture, which we sort of define as encompassing visual art, design and architecture, which is the area that I look after, and moving image, 20th century till now, global from an Asian perspective. And again, in this building, designed by Herzog and de Meuron, which is currently under construction, finally, and is scheduled to open at the end of 2019. Now, in terms of curating in place, I mean, I sort of took Jonathan's directive in a fairly straightforward way, because curating in place really is very much goes to the core of everything that we do, because our intention is to build this new global museum, but to do it in a way that's appropriate to where we are, which is in Hong Kong, China, East Asia, and Asia. So in addition to, so much of what we're doing is kind of building and constructing and retelling the narratives of art, design and architecture, and moving image in different parts of Asia, and in relationship to each other, and in terms of their relationship with the rest of the world, but also revisiting global narratives, let's say, from the vantage point of where we are in the world. And I thought I would just give an example of this, and I chose postmodern design because I thought it was something that might be familiar, or more familiar, at least by sight, to many people here. As you may know, Postmodern design is sort of a style or movement that really began to take shape in the 70s, sort of flourishing in the 80s, began as a kind of rebellion to or reaction against the kind of good taste and functionalism that had dominated design up until then. A lot of the beautiful things that James was just showing us, this was like trying to shatter all of that. It had a very strong intellectual underpinning, but of course, as you can probably guess, before long it came to be seen, or well, it came to be both derided and relished, perhaps, for its kind of gaudy colors, outrageousness, sort of the absurd sort of superficiality of all that it produced and influenced. It was typified mostly by the Memphis Group, which was the Milanese-based group in the 1980s, led by Ettore Sotzis, who's the guy with the mustache in the upper right-hand corner, who's going to come up again in my talk. But yeah, and you can see them here in this very iconic image of many of the Memphis Group members kind of lounging about in this crazy boxing ring / conversation pit designed by the Japanese designer Masanori Umeda. Now, in looking at Pomo, as it's also called, we thought, well, how can we revisit this by focusing perhaps on its Japanese participants? Do its Japanese members give us another entry point for thinking about this sort of wild and wacky moment in time that people now look back on with a level of embarrassment? So that brought us to Shiro Korematsu, who was probably the most prominent Japanese participant in Memphis, one of the great designers of the later 20th century, who was incredibly close with Sotzis. They had a very close relationship, what we might today call a bromance. And in 2011, there was a show in Tokyo that examined the kind of creative relationship between the two. But zooming in on Korematsu, we thought, let's really do it. Let's really dive deep into the work of this very profound designer, and we began examining his career in greater detail and collecting a lot of his works, including probably his most iconic piece on the right, the Miss Blanche chair from 1988, which was this very poetic assemblage of artificial roses captured, frozen in time, in these kind of fields of clear acrylic. Korematsu was very much influenced by, or very much looking at ideas of narrative and even poetry in design, enchantment, as he called it, often in a very, very lighthearted way. He was trying to sort of capture light as a material, examining light and shadow, form and formlessness, drawing dreams, drawing a lot from kind of these Japanese metaphysical concepts, as you can see in some of these works spanning 1969 to 1991, whether his luminous chair, the clock with 5 hands with its butterfly, dried fish and ladybug, this kind of meditation on time and mortality, or his Laputa bed, which prompted people to sort of sleep feet to feet. Some sketches that we got, again, really emphasizing that playful sense of storytelling and narrative that he brought to his work. Really powerful, more processual or conceptual approaches to design. This is a piece that we got from 1985, his homage to Joseph Hoffman. He took a reeditioned Joseph Hoffman chair, wrapped it in metal wire, and burned it, leaving this sort of ghost of a chair marked by both its absence and presence, presaging a lot of the more conceptual works that many contemporary designers are practicing by 20, 30 years. We've gone a little crazy on Korematsu, perhaps, acquiring also the entire interior and facade of this sushi bar that he designed in Tokyo in 1988. A spatial object, one might call it, that was also influenced very heavily by his interpretation of traditional Japanese tea house architecture. So, having sort of seen this other side of Pomo via Korematsu, that really is more deeply embedded with meaning and storytelling rather than this kind of bold, brash rebellion that Pomo became associated with, we thought, can we now zoom out and look at Soitsis, the kind of grand poobah of Pomo himself. And in sort of initially approaching Soitsis, we realized the kind of very reductive standard narrative of Soitsis has him beginning in the 1950s. He has a very hardcore, more hardcore industrial designer working for Olivetti, designing Italy's first mainframe computer, and then reappearing, at the end of the 60s with this Valentine typewriter, this bright lipstick red industrial product that kind of brought a pop sensibility into consumer goods. And then continuing into his more Italian radical period of the 70s, and then crescendoing with his, again, wild and wacky Pomo work from the 80s. Now, what was immediately, what became clear was it became clear that what was immediately missing, in this chronology was this big gap in the 1960s when Soitsis started going to India, kind of on the hippie trail, discovering all sorts of new agey spiritualism and mysticism. After his first trip, and this is a photo of him in India from 1988, a bit later, but he started going there in the early 60s. After his first trip, he came back, became very ill, went through a very dark period, and started making a lot of works that start showing a lot of the sort of tantric diagrams, mandalas, and other cosmological ideas that had made such a profound impact on him while he was in India. And you start seeing a more totemic or talismanic approach to the object in design showing up in his work during that time. And so we've started collecting Soitsis from the 60s as the beginning of a new trajectory by which we can sort of read postmodernism, especially as it was implemented or executed via the Japanese cohorts. And so coming back to this bed, this boxing ring, which has really normally been seen as this almost silly pastiche of different colors and motifs and typologies. You have the boxing ring, you have the tatami in all these weird colors and stripy patterns. We can maybe start to interpret that a little bit differently too. Once we start looking at Umeda, the designer's intentions via these drawings, which we've managed to collect, you start seeing this piece as a site for almost the various cycles of life, from starting with a funeral, oddly enough, life and death, and going into weddings. You see the seasons there, and joy, and ceremony, and ritual, to kind of discussion and eating and sleeping. So once again, this is just one example of one of the ways in which, from our place in the world, we're exploring if we can examine what is already known in other places too. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was really terrific. This is the moment in the dialogue where now I get to curate a conversation, supposedly amongst you, and I'm going to try to do that as lightly as possible. There was so much in there. I think Aric talking about how to be, on the one hand, about very abstract and global things like postmodern design, while at the same time being about some very specific things like East Asia and the way in which your position requires you to kind of do both and the results of that. Or James, this idea that first of all, wonderfully revealing, of course, that the appropriation of the term curator out of the museum world has its origins, of course, in selling, right? That I'm not selling you this, I'm curating it. But also suggesting that the market can actually do a type of curating that museums are not, and can kind of play a particular role, and a role that actually, to me, sounded familiar to some of the things that Zoe was talking about wanting to achieve in the museum space that only museums, right, as opposed to slipperier, faster forms of media can't do, like being with something at a one-to-one scale, or touching it, or engaging with other people in real space. And then, you know, finally back to Dan, for whom it seemed like there was this conflict between, on the one hand, the search don't sort imperative of the Google universe, which was that you could resort your collection dynamically at any time, and the power of that, with the like the fundamental limitations of the physical space in which you might put it, and that wonderful kind of Dutch sort that you did, where you tried to pack every item into the space at various sizes. I mean, I'm in looking at all of this, taken back to my initial question, which was had to do with whether in a kind of a digital information age, whether curators are still selectors, or whether they are Dan's word, filters, from earlier. And on that end, I might kind of ask the group, anyone who would like to talk a little more about the importance of physical space and place in the work that you do. And in some cases that answer might be obvious, but I'm going to count on all of you to make it rich and interesting. And then maybe we can start a little conversation going, and then I would invite people from the audience to raise their hands and join in. Great.
Okay, since I was first, I could respond to that. I think it's extremely important that people meet in some place that is physical, as Zoe mentioned, and interact in some way with an exhibition of something. I think in a way it all comes to this, and not because museums especially necessarily wants you to to learn or to know something that you didn't know before, but because there is some sort of energy to an exhibition, perhaps because it's temporary, I don't know, perhaps because of other reasons, that when people, if it's good, I would say, when people are getting there and when they're getting there together, I think there's something that is happening, and it cannot happen from your screen. That's what I believe. And in terms of my own project, I think it has something to do also with the way of interacting with these objects, and also with rethinking how do you interact with objects in a museum, right? Because if you have to stack a couple of hundreds of projects in a very small space, which is what I'm going to do soon, you have to give up some of the notions about proper ways of showing design. So this relates back to the fact that, can we have people sitting on these things? Can we have them stacked? Can we have a couple of collection items, one on top of the other? That's going to be a very difficult bureaucratic struggle on the one hand. But on the other hand, I think it could play with your notion of how things should be shown, and how could they communicate stories about what you have in your collections, or what you bring in different ways, and sort of reconsider ways of seeing and understanding design.
Shall I pick up the mantle? Maybe I like to think of us curators as your dance partner, because entering into an exhibition is actually quite an intimate thing. You have to have a level of trust. You're trusting that the curators have done some job for you, whatever that might be, selection, presentation, maybe telling some truths on the wall labels would help. I don't believe that museums are about absolute truths, which was sort of something that, I came from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and it was very much this idea of education, absolute truths, because I think narratives can always be rewritten. It's like science, isn't it? Isn't a truth. It can always be, sort of misproven. So, but I see us as, it's a kind of, the relationship you have with a museum is actually quite a fragile thing. So creating the space of the exhibition for me is actually a serious thing, because you have to bring people in. You're really trying to engage people in different ways, but you're also, they have to trust you, and they have to kind of at some point be in sync with you to understand what you're presenting and the lens through which you're presenting the works of art. So doing that at the Art Institute, I don't know about the other institutions, it can actually be quite difficult. They are very bureaucratic places. They have a lot of rules and regulations, but they're also very safe places. I mean, these are places where, they're fundamentally about ideas, and I do believe they should still be fundamentally about ideas. They're very much part of the market, and we talk about the finances and the budgets as much as we talk about ideas, but I still like to come back to ideas. But I think the place of the museum, for me, has to continually be interrogated, because convention is I'm a creature of habit. Although I travel a lot, I love being at home. So I'm a real creature of habit. Most of us are creatures of habit. So going to the museum, we know what to expect, but sometimes you have to have the unexpected. We have to evolve, and I think that's what we're searching for. And it's not easy in these big, ours, a big juggernaut of a place like a museum.
And I think it is funny, and the reason that I am now at R & Company, where we do curate exhibitions of historical and contemporary work, is the fact that I think I've found some sort of sweet spot where we can actually, there isn't as much bureaucracy, because after all, we're a commercial gallery, we're making quicker decisions. And one of the things that obviously we pay great attention to detail in terms of the space and how we present the work that we're putting on view in these exhibitions. But the one thing that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and it goes into the work that goes into the spaces, is also, since all of us here are dealing with design from the 1910s and the 1920s, but we're also dealing with work that is made right now, the role of connoisseurship. And connoisseurship often goes hand in hand with the ability, of course, to actually touch the work and feel the work, which is an advantage us commercial galleries have, because in the end, you can bring in collectors and they can flip the chair over and look at its condition, look for those early labels. But it's really interesting. It does, I think, vary, of course, from area to area that we focus on. With the work of Satsas and with the work of Kuramata and with the work of Memphis and Postmod, connoisseurship might not matter that much. After all, much of this work is kind of continually being produced. You can still buy new work from whatever company it is that controls the Memphis brand right now. You can still buy posthumous editioned work of Kuramata. And on the flip side, when you're looking at plywood, which is a big fixation of mine, or early American woodworking, it matters a whole lot, what date it is. It matters a whole lot what edition it is, and everything that puts together. So I think it's something that it's a constant wrestling. And I also see that when I travel to a lot of museums, in my old gig in Indianapolis, a sort of mixing of different, a new re-editioned work of something to fill in the gap for something. And I'm always kind of wondering, well, are people looking at the labels? Does this even matter? Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe all that matters is that we get that work out on view so that it can be Instagrammed. I don't know,
On the issue of space, of course, with all this sort of talk of the amount of information that's available online now, and so on and so forth, and the sort of accelerated, almost desperate sometimes efforts on the part of museums to address the digital realm, it's often felt like we're on this sort of road as museums towards planning our own obsolescence, right? But in fact, it's the opposite. That's really the case. I mean, if you even go back to like Walter Benjamin's famous essay on the aura of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he proposed that the more the image of a work of art was reproduced and seen, the less the aura of the work of art itself, right? But in fact, it's been the opposite. The more widely disseminated images of works are, the greater the desire to see the original thing. I mean, the lines to see the Mona Lisa are getting longer, not shorter, and museums as physical spaces are are facing increasing demands on them in ways that go beyond their original remit. I mean, it's not just a place to see art, as Ellie said, but also they have to be places to hang out, for people to learn, for civic spaces now. Museums are now spaces for public life, as one of our friends likes to say. So with us, that has put added demands on the design of our building. So, I mean, for example, I'll just quickly, whereas I think historically, education spaces, now learning interpretation, I think is the more fashionable term, were sort of these afterthoughts that were stuck in the basement by the bathrooms. In our building, I mean, this whole corner, which faces Victoria Harbor, is the learning center, so really prime, up front and center real estate. In terms of curatorial practices, I think it's all sort of related, right? I mean, with curatorship being such an overused word, and everybody being able to go online and curate their own Instagram accounts or Pinterest pages or whatever it is that they do. In fact, that's probably only heightened the need for, let's say capital C curators or curatorship of any kind. I mean, when we first started at M+ in Hong Kong, I mean, this is this kind of museum is a very new thing for Hong Kong, and it's taken some time for people to really understand what it is that we do. And so when we first arrived, there's a sense that many of us, including myself, I'm not from Hong Kong, I'm from Chicago actually, were sort of parachuted in, and there were a lot of questions from people, along the lines of, what are your criteria for making selections or deciding programming and exhibitions? And then that would be followed up by, what qualifies you to be making those decisions? And I remember in the midst of all of all this rancor, I happened to be having drinks one night with a friend who was with Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia. And I love telling this story because I thought, here I am with sort of the poster child of decentralizing authority and knowledge and so on and so forth. Why don't I ask him what he thinks about the need for curators, and maybe exhibitions should be crowdsourced or collection should be crowdsourced? And he immediately, without skipping a beat, said, no, that's wrong, because there's so much information out there, people want somebody, like a real name and a face, to tell them a story. And they want that opinion, they want that viewpoint to bring some clarity amidst all the sort of, all the jumble out there. So yes, space is more important and curatorship is more important, despite, I think, what the broader phenomenon might lead you to think in a very counterintuitive way.
Yep. Please. Wait, you have a microphone coming to you.
Do you feel that attendance to these exhibits that you're curating dictates your success, and how much of that is considered into the success of an exhibit that you're putting together?
I think in Indianapolis it mattered.
How much?
Well, because Indianapolis doesn't have a huge group of non-Indianapolis residents coming to visit it, so it became pretty important in terms of, how do you bring people back over and over again?
I would say it's important everywhere, and I think it's specifically important for museums more than galleries. That they might have a different approach sometimes, and I think it dictates things definitely. I think you should find a way to make your exhibition both accessible and smart. And I think this is one of the bigger challenges that we have in what we do, which is basically how do you create a multi-layered project in which somebody could go in, take an Instagram shot, be there 20 seconds. I did a project for the Venice Biennale. So this was the Israeli pavilion, people who do not know the difference between Israel and Egypt, seriously, they do not know because they're from the other side of the world. They pass through, they spend 20 seconds, that's real statistics, 20 seconds in the pavilion, they leave, okay? And then there's the biggest expert on Israeli architecture who's going to spend there 40 minutes. And the exhibition has to, play this game with all of them. And I think most of the good exhibitions that I can think of are doing exactly that.
I think exhibitions are important. Now, audience is important, but it seemed like you guys are interested in making innovations in how people are seeing exhibitions. And I wanted to know, I mean, there's a conversation between professionals here, and that there's also a conversation between professionals when you're formulating exhibitions. And I just want to know, is there an ongoing sort of formal conversation internationally about innovations in exhibitions? Can anybody talk about that? Because it seems like this is what you guys are sort of addressing, how you can, expand the vocabulary about how exhibitions are formulated and bringing up the audience along. Am I being clear?
Yeah. Can I maybe take this on? I think your question is really quite fascinating, because if this was a panel of art curators, I think the dialogue actually would be much more robust. I mean, there's many more books out there, for example, about the history of art exhibitions, the design of art exhibitions, the curators of art exhibitions, and it's really startling how little is written about the history of architecture and design exhibitions. I mean, they have they're much younger, they're much shorter lifespan, but still, I mean, we're not talking, the last 100 years at least. I'm not sure if there's a formal conversation about how we do exhibitions, but we definitely, panels like this get you thinking about what you do. I think it definitely, we have groups within the museum that we talk to. Talking about learning interpretation. Now curators, I think there's this fallacy that we work alone. You're not working alone. You're not Einstein coming up with a great idea and jotting it down, and your minions go and sort of, develop the idea for you. You're working with teams of experts. One of the most amazing things about working at the Art Institute is everybody that's there. It doesn't matter what they're doing. The painters, the carpenters, the art handlers, the conservation crew, they're all incredible. So you'd be a fool to just constantly be looking outside the walls for inspiration. You have really great teams within. So the conversation is always rich. But that's a little bit why I'm working on this book that very much looks specifically, only 11 case studies that I'm looking at, but looks at sort of the history of how architecture and design exhibitions have developed, but in all different formats. So some are expos, some are museum shows, some are gallery shows, because it also depends on where you're producing that exhibition, and then it goes back to the idea of audience. Your audience then is very, very different, because it's not only just about getting numbers through the exhibition, it's also who are those people? The kind of what's the makeup of that attendance? That to me is as important than how many people. If we can engage a teenager for longer than 20 seconds in the gallery, I feel like we've got a success on our hands. Because they're probably the audience that is probably the hardest to. They know everything, and they come with the most amazing questions. So I'm very conscious also on what the audience is made up of.
I think you mentioned visual culture. And it just seems to me, it just strikes me that, like Nicholas Mirzov talks about visual objects, but he also talks about the history of how we look at those objects. And it seems like you guys are embarking on sort of like a bare bones way to have people not only look at objects, but also think about how the history of how they're looking at them by making innovations in exhibitions. Does that make sense? I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, I think one thing you said that really struck me was this idea of, I think you put it, leading your audience along, right? And Dan was talking about finding that sweet spot between accessibility and being smart. Not that the two are mutually exclusive, of course. But I think it really is, it comes down to a matter of sort of finding the right entry points, right? Because you can't expect a museum exhibition to teach you everything that you ever wanted to know about a certain subject. The viewer holds some responsibility as well. But what you can do is find entry points that will kind of grab the visitor's attention and then sort of lead them along, as you said, into other realms, because part of a museum's job also, we mustn't forget, is to sort of expand people's thinking. And nowadays especially, that's probably more important than ever.
I think your question is also very relevant to design rather than art exhibition, for instance, because if you show objects in a design or architecture exhibitions, so they have a dual role, right? On the one hand, there are chairs, right? So you can sit on them. If they were in a hotel lobby, you would just go and sit on these chairs. But then when they're presented in the museum context, so there's something else to be told about them. So it might be process, as you said, it might be their histories, etc. But I think in design, it's a much more relevant question than in art, when you go and expect to see a work of art on the wall.
One more, right?
I'm not quite sure. I'm Jerome Schmidt. You were BFA 1974, SAIC. Is part of your job to put the nameplates on there and put all those little stories on there? Because I'm one of those people, I hate the new medias. I mean, 5 seconds I look at a video screen. For what it's worth, we're sharing. I'd rather read some little history and sideline and teach me something like that. Is that your job too? Or
It's my job, yeah.
it is
Part
your
of my,
job.
yeah, part of what I do.
Yours. So in this dialogue, you're considering art as function, chair, pottery as design, correct? Sometimes. I'm losing the aesthetics on some of these things, and also on the historical aspect, you're going from the 20s plywood. I'd like to know why it was influenced at that time. There's a lot of information. You might call it education, but I gather a lot of information about an object, why it was made, what materials were available at the time, for what it's worth. But I do thank you for your participation.
That was more of a manifesto, but it was good. Yeah.
Any last words from the panel? All right. I think we're a little bit over time already, so thank you, everybody, and my thanks to EXPO as well. Take care.